In our headlines at this hour, stocks here and elsewhere are responding sharply to widespread fears of a recession as monetary policymakers take aggressive actions to contain soaring inflation. And South Korea is maintaining its 7-day quarantine mandate for COVID-19 patients for the time being, as healthcare experts call for caution despite retreating caseloads. Meanwhile, the Finance Ministry has shared a dismal outlook with regard to the South Korean economy amid the current challenges facing the global community. Hello and welcome. You're watching the Daily Report. It's Friday afternoon, June 17th here in South Korea. Global stock markets tumbled on Thursday, heavily burdened by rampant fears of a recession as central banks in Europe emulated the US Federal Reserve's aggressive rate hike to curb inflation. Our Choi Min-jung has more on the market's response.
Just a day after a historic rate hike by the Federal Reserve, US stocks tumbled. On Thursday, the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell below the 30,000 level for the first time in 17 months. The S&P 500 dropped 3.2%, and the Nasdaq edged down by 4.1%. Markets had initially rallied on Wednesday after the Fed announced it would raise its key interest rate by 75 basis points, the largest hike since 1994. However, the figures were reversed as investors feared that the Fed's aggressive monetary policy to curb inflation could potentially result in a recession. And those concerns spread among traders as markets suffered a steep decline from all-time highs. The S&P 500 dropped by roughly a quarter, the Nasdaq was down by more than a third, while the Dow was almost 20% below its all-time intraday high in January. Stocks in Europe also fell significantly on Thursday. The Stoxx 50, a European stock index, dropped by nearly 3%. Indices in the UK, Germany, and France also saw around a 2 to 3% slide. The decline came after the Swiss National Bank raised interest rates for the first time in 15 years with a 50 basis points increase. Meanwhile, the Bank of England also announced a 25 basis points hike. Analysts say stock markets will remain volatile until there are clear signs of inflation stabilizing, as central banks would no longer need to implement aggressive rate hikes. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
Quite a number of Americans believe their country is already in recession. According to a joint survey of 1,500 Americans by The Economist and YouGov from June 11 to the 14th, 56% said yes to a question about whether the U.S. is in recession. Only 22% said no. 1 out of 4 Americans also claim the current recession is worse than the 2008 global financial crisis. The majority of respondents regarded the prices of goods and services as indicators of recession. Here on the local front, speculation is growing about, quote, a big step by the Bank of Korea to rein in inflation to keep pace with efforts by its U.S. counterpart to tackle its own skyrocketing consumer prices. Our Ian Jin explains.
The U.S. Federal Reserve took a giant step this week by raising its key interest rates by 0.75 percentage points to 1.75%, its highest increase in 28 years. Now the Bank of Korea has had no choice but to follow suit and implement its own big step interest rate hike. In order to minimize impact on the South Korean economy, South Korea's interest rates need to stay in tandem with interest rates in the U.S. In a scenario where U.S. interest rates were higher than Korea's, the result could be a massive flow of capital out of Korea's economy. But the Fed has also announced that benchmark rates will rise up to 3.4% by the end of the year, consequently making it more likely for South Korea to also increase its rates. There are 4 more Federal Open Market Committee meetings scheduled this year in July, September, November, and December. It is highly expected that another giant step may be taken in July, raising interest rates another 0.75 percentage points. Fears loom over what the BOK may decide over the 4 Monetary Policy Board meetings it has remaining this year, and whether it will take an unprecedented big step of a 0.5 percentage point interest rate increase.
We need to understand how it affects the foreign exchange market and the bond market rather than the interest rate gap itself.
Some experts and analysts suggest that a gradual increase in increments of 0.25 percentage points would be better than a big step hike.
A benchmark interest rate hike is inevitable, but a jump in interest rates will only worsen the challenges to the economy. We need a gradual increase.
As much as a sudden jump in interest rates is expected to shock the market, it will also impact the country's economy. This comes amid global efforts to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the prolonged war between Russia and Ukraine. Further policy coordination is expected between the Ministry of Finance and the central bank to counter high inflation and the nation's household debt issues at next month's meeting. 이은진, Arirang News.
And indeed, South Korea may be looking ahead to some tough tides on the economic front. Now, this is according to the Finance Ministry, and our Jeong has more on its assessment.
Due to economic uncertainties both at home and abroad, there are concerns over a slowdown for the South Korean economy. This is the assessment made by the Finance Ministry's latest economic green book on Friday, which says the economic recovery in South Korea may be losing steam.
Amid the soaring inflation and the worsening economic situation abroad, there are concerns over economic slowdown. The country's recovery in exports and investment may weaken.
The average daily exports grew by around 11% last month compared to a year earlier, led by semiconductors and petroleum products. But the on-year growth in exports slowed compared to that of April, which was more than 15%. Also, the balance of trade in April came to a deficit of $80 million as import prices of commodities surged by almost 38% on-year amid the war in Ukraine. As prices of commodities and energy rise globally, South Korea's consumer price index last month spiked by 5.4% from a year ago, the steepest rise since 2008 during the global financial crisis. The government has raised its inflation outlook for this year to a 14-year high of 4.7%. It's a drastic increase from the 2.2% estimate made in December. Also, its latest economic growth forecast was slashed to 2.6% from an earlier projection of 3.1%. Meanwhile, the Green Book said that the country's employment is recovering, with around 28 million people being employed in May, an increase of 3.4% from the same period a year earlier. It also said domestic demand is recovering, led by the service industry with the lifting of social distancing measures. The government says it'll implement new economic policies to stabilize consumer prices and lay the foundations for overcoming the low economic growth. 엄지영, Arirang News.
A wage differential system has failed to secure adequate support. This means the minimum wage next year will remain the same across industries. A vote among 27 officials on Thursday at the Minimum Wage Commission complex on a proposal for different minimum wages depending on businesses saw 16 officials voting against and 11 in favor. Pundits say the vote is a blow for President Yoon Suk-yeol, who had pledged to put in place a wage differential system while on his campaign trail. Meanwhile, that is, the minimum wage rate will be decided at a later meeting. Over at the National Assembly, taming inflation appears to be the common goal of ruling and opposition party lawmakers, and it remains to be seen whether this shared goal will pave the path to tangible bipartisan economic efforts. Our Lee Kyung-eun reports.
The People Power Party on Thursday convened the first meeting of its special committee to stabilize inflation and people's livelihoods. Seen as part of the Yoon administration's economic reform drive, and on the day, the new policy framework was released addressing those very issues.
Together with experts, we will listen to the voices of the people and devise policy proposals while doing our part in terms of making any necessary laws.
The committee emphasizes that rising inflation is here to stay for a while, mainly due to the Ukraine war and lockdowns in China. But it will push for immediate measures first, like a further oil tax cut, most likely up to 37%.
Under law, the president has the right to reduce the tax up to 30%, which is what's currently in place. But we agreed to ask the government to increase it.
It also called interest rates to be raised in a gradual manner as opposed to drastically like in the U.S., but refrained from making any proposals, leaving it up to the central bank to make its decision independently as it should. The meeting comes just a few days after the main opposition Democratic Party also convened its own session on the same matter.
As the biggest party, we're responsible to do the best we can for people's livelihoods. With such commitment, I, the floor leader, will be in charge of this committee.
And as the first step, the committee went out to a market to see for themselves.
수박이 그러면 4~5천 원 올랐으면 우리 청장님 그래도 한 20% 넘게 오르는 거.
이게 지금 수박이 아니라 금박이요, 금박. 요즘에.
Many of the measures will require changes to the law, not to mention revising oil tax cuts. But with the rival parties now have one common priority of taming inflation, eyes are on whether they can effectively resolve their feud and work for bipartisan cooperation. Youngin, Arirang News.
Right, and on that note, we end part one of the Daily Report. In part two, we address the blistering heatwave here in the Northern Hemisphere and its repercussions. Stay with us.
Share South Korea's experience in tackling COVID-19 and introduce a Korean new day. A Korean survivor of Japan's wartime sex slavery met with
extraordinary climate crisis, a pledge to work with the EU to tackle the challenge.
The objective of its North Korea policy is
protesters gathering across the country to peacefully demand an end to hate and violence.
Arirang, what matters?
Feel so good right now. Maybe I had a drink or two, but this somehow feels like it's forever. All my friends are here having fun and feeling good right now. Maybe this is forever.
Welcome back. Parts of the Northern Hemisphere facing historic heat waves, that are disrupting lives and destroying crops, to say the least. For more, I have Director Suruchi Badwal at the Energy and Resources Institute over in India. Director Badwal, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you.
I also have Professor Christian Franz K at Pusan National University live on the line. Professor Franz K, it's been a while. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Director Badwal, we'll start with you. India has been enduring unbearable heat starting March this year, and experts claim it is unprecedented. Could you start by telling us more about that reality?
Yeah, so we have our summer starting in March, and this year somehow March started off with a comparatively higher temperatures than what we've been observing in the region. And what was really surprising that we observed was that the temperatures just didn't go down, and it consistently stayed high. So India is used to experiencing temperatures above 40 degrees in summers. But, this was unusual because just at the start of the summer, the temperature started touching 40 and above. And it continued to stay there and did not fall. So, yes, it has been unusual for us. And for many weeks, I think people had to face the harsh heat for weeks and days. And what we also observed was the night temperatures were not falling. So the air that basically we were experiencing around us was warmer even in the nights. So, the productivity levels affecting people's health, etc., there were huge consequences that we basically experienced.
Right, I am sure, of course. And Professor Franz K, South Korea itself has also been witnessing unusually warm weather, even during the winter. That being said, what can you share with us about the changes in climate here in South Korea, Professor?
So over the last 100 years, Korea has already warmed by about 1.8 degrees. So because of that, we can also now expect more intense and more frequent heat waves. So what used to be an extreme heat wave in the past will become much more normal. So something we might experience maybe once every 20 years might become an event which might occur every other year. Also, besides increasing temperatures, we also already observed that the number of heavy rain events has increased in frequency by about 25% and also in intensity. So that we might now get 13 millimeters more per square meter. And also the risk of those heavy precipitation events is also much higher here in the southern part of Korea than in the central region. Also, research by my colleagues here at ICCP shows that Korea can expect more intense typhoons in the future. So in summary, Korea can expect more disasters due to heat waves, extreme precipitation, or typhoons due to global warming, and that's not something we might actually experience in the future. That's also already something we can experience now, and consequently, this also then leads then to increased economic damages and also human health problems.
Right, which we will delve into in a bit. But first then, Director Badwal, back in India, that is, some say the heat wave there is testing the limits of human survival. Do you agree? I mean, what have been some of the callous consequences of the sweltering spring there?
Because this is something that even personally speaking, I have never experienced from where I come in Delhi. Of course, half of the country was experiencing this heat wave condition. We are used to heat wave conditions in a pocketed way in one part of the country or the other, where temperatures are exceedingly high in the summers. And of course, there is a heat wave impact. But what happened this year is half of the country, 2/3 of the country was engulfed with this heat wave condition, and quite early on in the summers. So personally speaking, we have never experienced something like this before. For me also, where I'm in my middle age right now, experiencing this was for the first time to see how the temperatures, remained constantly high. And also that in the evenings, when the air normally cools down with the fall in temperatures, it wasn't happening this time. So your productivity levels, while in the day hours, were going down because of the high temperatures, you were not even productive during the evening hours. It was affecting you the moment you were moving out of air-conditioned space into a non-air conditioned space because the temperature difference between a cooled area versus a non-cooled area was quite stark. So I'm just imagining, so many people definitely would have been affected because the kind of population we are a low middle income country, and not every person has access to cooling devices of the kind that can help them wade through such situations. So I'm just imagining the thousands and millions of people out there who do not have access to these facilities and services. What would have happened to them in terms of the impact on health and their productivity levels? And of course, the productivity levels directly linked to incomes and aggravating poverty.
Right, and staying with that issue on productivity, Director Badwal, I understand that the early heat wave also has disrupted school curriculums there. Could you tell us more?
Yes, it has. In fact, some governments have basically made a decision to extend the summer break in schools because, and of course, it would have an impact on the curriculums in terms of what will be covered. We did have a great impact because of the COVID, but of course, even after the COVID, when things have started opening out, because of the heat conditions that we face now, we are having to roll back certain things, and schools are going to be having an extended break again.
Right, I see. And Professor Franske, some pundits claim that India's relatively early onslaught of the scorching heat may have regional repercussions that could extend to the Far East, meaning here in South Korea. What are your thoughts?
Unfortunately, we also have to expect such events here in Korea. So earlier this year, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they published 3 big reports on climate change and what we can expect in the future. So they reviewed the scientific literature, and for Korea, they kind of predict or project the temperature rise by about 2 degrees by 2050 and by up to 5 degrees by 2100. Even if we would commit to or perform drastic reductions in carbon emissions, we would still experience in Korea temperature rise by about 1 degree over the next 80 years or so.
Right, a very gloomy picture right there, Professor, right?
Yes, and that of course will also then have consequences for the intensity and frequency of heat waves. So by 2100, we can expect to have in certain locations here in Korea 3 times more heat wave days than we currently have. So that's of course then also has very strong impacts on the economy and human health. And it's not only heat waves, also other extreme precipitation events. As I already mentioned, precipitation or typhoons will become more intense and perhaps also more frequent. So, but coming back to heat waves, Korea will also become much more vulnerable to heat waves when it comes to heat-related illnesses and death.
Professor, going back to your mention about the economic repercussions of such weather patterns, what are some of the broader economic implications of such unpredictable, unfavorable weather patterns?
So first, maybe let me say they are not, I mean, on one hand, they're unpredictable when they occur, but of course, we know or we can anticipate that they will occur much more frequently and will become more intense. And we already know this or anticipate this for a long time. So we kind of already have the knowledge to prepare for them so that we can mitigate the consequences, that we might suffer less from the consequences. And some of the consequences are, of course, loss of labor productivity, especially if you have to work outdoors. Indoor workers, we, of course, have the luxury of air conditioning, so that won't affect us too much, but construction workers or agricultural workers, they, of course, have to work in the heat. Then, of course, indoor workers or at home, we might then increase our use of air conditioning. That, of course, currently we also have very high energy prices that increases our costs even further. And if everybody turns on their air conditioning at the same time, that, of course, can also bring us to the limit of this electricity supply. So we might face the potential of outages. And that, of course, then can cascade also into the wider economy, so that supply chains are affected if, say, certain companies would need to stop producing things. So that's one, or some impacts, of course. Increased temperatures can also lead to drought conditions, which might then affect agricultural yields, so we might then get less, or can harvest less rice or other agricultural produce, and also can increase the risk of wildfires, which then also could lead to poorer air quality and all the other risks associated with wildfires. And of course, heat increases also mortality and other heat-related illnesses, that the heat stroke or exhaustion. So last year, we already experienced here in Korea about 1,300 heat-related illnesses. And if we look back to 2018, when there was a major heat wave here in Korea, then there were about 4,500 heat-related illnesses, which then can also put much more stress on our health services here.
Right, Professor Franske, that's a very daunting list, a very intimidating list of the repercussions that we are likely to face. And keeping that in mind, Director Badwal, what then are some of the efforts being made by Indian authorities to address the country's heat wave and its related repercussions on the people?
So we are a tropical country. We already experience high temperatures, as I said, and then we started early on in when we started, in the 21st century. So early part of the 21st century, we did have heat wave conditions getting created in one or the other parts of the country. So the government of India basically has connected to a heat wave warning system through the Indian Met Department, where now more than 140, 150 cities across the country are provided information based on forecasts related to creation of heat wave conditions. And these warnings are provided to cities for better preparedness towards the ensuing, heat wave conditions that may get created over the next few days or weeks in particular regions. And therefore, it then leaves it to the city governments to basically take action, corrective measures that may help people cope with the ensuing conditions. So this is one of the biggest things I think the government of India has been able to do in terms of providing these early forecasts and warnings linked to it to cities, governments for better preparedness and action towards these heat wave conditions that are getting created. But definitely, it's so far restricted to cities and municipalities. It does not cover all parts of the country. And of course, while these heat wave warnings are issued by the Met Department, how effectively do city governments take it forward to reach it to every person and community out there, habitation out there, in terms of what they should be doing, the standard operating protocols during these conditions, the do's and the don'ts that people should be basically following to protect themselves and not get severely affected. It's not uniform, it's not very clear, and there's a long way to go with regard to communicating warning systems and messages around it and the advisories around it, and reaching it all the way down to the last person who should be knowing about it to be able to be better prepared. So I think all those areas are clear areas of gaps, and over time need to be filled up to have a robust system of providing information, generating information for effective action to be able to respond or deal with the consequences of heat waves.
Right, of course. Professor Franske, the weather, the blistering heat has been linked to climate change, and with related efforts, that is, US President Joe Biden will host a virtual leader-level meeting of the Major Economies Forum on Energy and Climate later on this Friday. Now, that being said, what are some of the basic efforts that we as individuals can perhaps make to hold temperatures steady?
I mean, part of the problem is, of course, that we emit too many greenhouse gases, and that's, of course, related to our use of energy. So if we use less energy, save more energy, that that's something we all can try to do. One example is, of course, we could switch to more energy efficient LED light bulbs instead of using less energy efficient bulbs. And we can, of course, also try to use less air conditioning by kind of turning down the temp or turning up the temperature a little bit so that we don't cool down too much. I mean, that also uses less energy. Then other things all of us can easily do. We can use more public transportation or walk more instead of taking the elevator. We could just take the steps or so. Then on a larger picture, we of course maybe should also switch to electric or hydrogen cars. We can all eat less meat because the production of meat also produces lots of greenhouse gases. And maybe on a bigger picture, if we look at the government or also city government, Korea must increase the amount of renewable energies we produce and can then use, and also have a plan to phase out fossil fuel use over the next years or decade. Another thing I think is also very important to make high temperatures more bearable would be to have more green spaces in cities. The trees and so would also give us more shade, reduces temperatures, also has other advantages like cleaning the air. So that's something we all can do in our private lives, and of course can tell our politicians that they should look into this.
Right, and staying with such efforts, Director Badwell, what can you share with us about your centre's campaign perhaps to ensure a sustainable living environment?
Yeah, I think all the many things that the professor had to say, so while when we talk about climate change, it is a global issue, it's a global problem, a problem created by collectives of all nations, and definitely whatever actions taken at a particular unit level, country or individual level, of course, does contribute in its own way in terms of addressing the overall problem issue. But, until and unless all nations come together and give massive commitments in terms of restricting the temperatures to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees centigrade, I don't think so there's going to be much in terms of an effect, globally speaking, in terms of the direction of changes in which we are heading. But individually speaking, a lot can be done in terms of what you can do in terms of switching off the lights where it's not needed, the cooling in terms of what the professor said, having the temperatures high, which may basically put lesser demand on energy if the energy is being produced by fossil fuel-based sources. Shift towards renewables, clean energy, looking at other alternatives of commuting, promoting public transportation, efficient vehicles, shift towards low emitting fuels, sequestration, promoting afforestation, reforestation.
Right.
So a lot of measures that one can do at their own level, but what impact basically makes collectively at the global level, of course, is where nations have to pitch in and make commitments that are far more, aggressive.
Right, they have to be tangible then, right?
Yeah,
it
to
needs
be able to
global
create
effort.
a global impact, because
Right.
otherwise the impacts will still continue.
Right. All right, Director Badwell, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today, but thank you very much for your time and your thoughts from India. And Professor Franz K, as always, thank you for your time as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
2 years ago, a South Korean official was brutally killed at sea by North Korean soldiers. Back then, under the former administration, relevant authorities had claimed the South Korean man had been trying to defect. Today, South Korea's maritime and military authorities say there is no evidence to support that claim. Our Lee Chi-yoon shares this tragic story.
The Coast Guard has changed its stance on the presumption it made in 2020 about a South Korean fisheries official who was killed by North Korea's military. Back on September 21st, 2020, North Korea shot dead a 47-year-old South Korean official in waters on the northern side of the Yellow Sea. The South Korean Coast Guard at that time said that the official appeared to have been defecting to the north, which his family flatly denied, and asked the government to disclose any information. But on Thursday, the Coast Guard announced that it has found no evidence that would suggest the official was trying to defect. And aside from an apology, the Coast Guard is also going to disclose the documents from its investigation. This comes as the Presidential National Security Office suspended a judicial procedure pursued by the previous Moon Jae-in administration to block the disclosure of confidential information on the official's death. The NSO added it hopes the latest decision would help overturn some unfair measures from the past. 이지윤, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, health authorities have announced their intentions to maintain the 7-day quarantine requirement for COVID-19 patients here in the country. Our Song Yujin has more on their intentions and reasons.
Mandatory quarantine for those who test positive for COVID will stay in place for 4 more weeks. This means those who catch COVID will still have to self-isolate for 7 days. The decision was made at a Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasures headquarters meeting on Friday. Health authorities decided to keep the quarantine rules in place over fears of a possible virus resurgence.
Although South Korea has the medical capacity to contain the virus, the number of COVID-19 related deaths is still relatively high. So, we evaluated that relieving quarantine measures could trigger an early virus resurgence and cause more damage.
However, the government could lift or shorten the quarantine if they deem the country's virus situation as stable, with the situation to be reassessed every 4 weeks. However, there is some good news for those who have loved ones at care facilities and nursing homes.
Before, only those who have been fully vaccinated were allowed to make in-person visits, but now their visitors can come regardless of vaccination status. Also, care facility residents who have been gotten their 4th shots will be able to leave their residence.
With the safety of residents in mind, reservations for visits should still be made beforehand, and visitors will have to get a PCR or rapid antigen test. Meanwhile, South Korea saw 7,198 new COVID-19 infections on Thursday. That's down almost 800 from the day before and is the 8th straight day for the figure to stay below 10,000. There were 9 related deaths and there are 82 critically ill patients. 송유진, Arirang News.
Across the border for the 3rd straight day, North Korea is seeing its daily tally of suspected COVID-19 infections below the 30,000 mark. Its state-run media says over 23,000 cases of fever were confirmed over the most recent 24-hour period. No new fatalities were reported. Since its first confirmation of Omicron in late April, North Korea has recorded more than 4.5 million fever cases. The country claims 99% of them have fully recovered. Also, in North Korea-related news, the United States has conveyed to China its concerns about a possible nuclear bomb test by North Korea. According to U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan Thursday, the concerns were addressed during a meeting in Luxembourg this week with China's top diplomat. Asked whether the superpowers had reached a consensus on that matter, Sullivan said they have to wait and see, quote, how things play out. Separately, the U.S. State Department also on Thursday said North Korea remains unresponsive to U.S. calls for talks. It also reaffirmed the Biden administration's commitment to diplomatically engage with North Korea without any preconditions. South Korea's exports are moving beyond cars and chips as well as movies and music to makgeolli. This alcoholic beverage in the past brought together the communists, but today it's looking to take, pardon the cliche, Korea to the world. Our Shin Yeon reports.
It used to be a drink for commoners. Now it connects Korea to the world. It's makgeolli. Makgeolli is the oldest alcoholic beverage in Korea, going back to the 10th century. It was long considered a cheap drink favored by older men and poor farmers because it was easy to brew. All that's needed is steamed rice, yeast, water, and some time to wait for it to ferment. But recently, many youngsters have jumped on the trend of brewing the traditional rice wine at home. Some have even made it into a business. According to National Tax Service, the number of liquor manufacturing licenses in 2021 increased by 11% compared to just 2 years earlier. The savory taste of makgeolli is even becoming known outside of Korea. According to Korea Customs, makgeolli exports increased by 28% on year in 2021. In the first quarter of this year, exports are up 11%. An expert in Korean traditional wines explained why.
Thanks to Hallyu, the Korean wave, more foreigners have been wanting to try what their favorite Korean celebrities eat and drink. That's how I think most of them found out that Korean traditional wine is unique. We make most of our alcohol with what we eat on a daily basis, rice. That's different from how wine or beer is made, so it's appealing.
As makgeolli gets more and more popular, makgeolli companies have been asked by global brands to do collaborations. That's why burger company Shake Shack has come up with this special drink. It's a milkshake made with makgeolli, a makgeolli shake.
We chose to make a beverage out of makgeolli to mark our 5th anniversary in Korea. We were aware that our ancestors drank this whenever there was something to celebrate. It also helps that makgeolli is winning the hearts of younger South Koreans.
As well as Shake Shack, other companies are trying to do collaborations with makgeolli, anticipating how big it can be thanks to its growing global popularity. 신예은, Arirang News.
Here in Seoul, part of the Doneumun Museum Village has been transformed into a large canvas displaying the latest digital artwork. Under the theme 100 Years of Seoul, the 11-meter-tall facade displays a variety of media art pieces from 11 a.m. to 9 p.m. 7 days a week. The exhibition will run for a year. First to be showcased is the work by South Korean media artist Lee Nam, who recreates Seoul's landmarks through a mix of light, sound and music. The project is part of the city's plan to make Seoul a digital culture city that is, centered on the creation of digital media artwork. On the entertainment front, the men in blue are back here in South Korea. My colleague Kim Bo-kyung has more on their return.
35 million people in 25 countries over the past 30 years. Such huge numbers for just one performance group. But Blue Man Group has done it. As virus prevention restrictions are removed, more and more globally renowned artists are visiting South Korea, including these men in blue. They are here in South Korea for the first time in 14 years. Though they were supposed to come to the country 2 years ago, the pandemic pushed their tour back until now. The performers are thrilled to finally be up on stage.
There was a long time, I think, where we thought, will there ever be an end? Will the show actually come back? So it feels fantastic to be able to do it again, and the fact that now we can even tour around the world and keep doing it, it's a pretty great feeling.
Blue Man Group used mundane items such as PVC pipes and marshmallows, turning them into musical instruments and props, as language is not used. And that is the part of excitement, the show captain says.
What are the attractive points of non-verbal performance compared to other shows?
So actually non-verbal performance gives us a lot of freedom to express things that go beyond words. So we can communicate through our eyes and through, I would say, a feeling that we have, and also through our musical instruments. It gives us a whole new world to express ourselves with that goes beyond words.
The captain says blue is the most appropriate color to show the group's identity.
Blue is really that it matches very well the qualities of this character, which is open-minded, curious, and very interesting.
To enjoy the show better, the performer says bring an open mind. And the more audiences enjoy the show, the more energy the performers get.
We often consider the audience sort of the fourth Blue Man or the fourth character, because we interact with the audience so much that we come out to the audience during the show. The energy of the audience changes the show, it changes us on stage.
The show runs until August 7th. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now.
Leaders of Germany, France, Italy and Romania have visited Ukraine and met with President Volodymyr Zelensky in a show of support amid the ongoing Ukraine conflict. After talks with the Ukrainian president on Thursday, EU leaders expressed that the war-torn nation should be granted EU candidate status. Speaking during the trip, Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz said that, quote, Ukraine belongs to the European family. Although Zelensky has thanked the West for its assistance, Ukrainian officials have voiced criticism that its allies have been soft on Russia and delayed arms supply deliveries and tougher sanctions. 3 American volunteer fighters have been reported missing in Ukraine as fears mount that they may have been captured by Russian forces. U.S. officials on Thursday confirmed that they haven't yet asked Moscow about the missing fighters and that Moscow has not claimed to have captured them. Washington called on Russia to respect the rights of any American prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention, with access to medical care and a ban on torture. According to reports, 2 military veterans from Alabama were reportedly captured on June 9th by Russian forces in a battle in the northern town of Vitebsk. The State Department also confirmed a 3rd missing volunteer, but didn't provide details. Protests have erupted in India's northeastern Bihar state in response to a new military recruitment system. According to reports, protesters on Thursday set fire to train carriages and an office of India's ruling party. Called Agnipath, or the Path of Fire program, the system was announced on Tuesday and aims to hire soldiers for 4 years only, as the army tries to cut its pension expenditure and modernize its forces with younger personnel. The government plans to open 46,000 spots to those aged between 17.5 and 21 years old. But after the 4-year period, only a quarter of them will be able to stay in the army. Despite the ongoing Spanish heatwave, worshippers in Toledo braved the streets to watch the Corpus Christi procession. With temperatures reaching 39 degrees Celsius amid Spain's earliest heatwave in 40 years, spectators watched as an effigy representing Jesus was carried on worshippers' shoulders on Thursday. To combat the heat, the local town hall handed out fans and 10,000 bottles of water. The heatwave is set to continue until the end of the week, with temperatures climbing above 40 degrees Celsius in parts of Spain. After fleeing Afghanistan for Iraq following the Taliban's return to power last year, 32 students received their bachelor's degrees in various fields, including law, computer science and business. The graduation ceremony held at the University of Sulaimani was attended by Iraq's President Barham Salih, who offered his congratulations. The students, who were originally enrolled at the American University of Afghanistan, had fled to Iraq over fears they would be unable to complete their studies. Figures released by the UNHCR indicate that Afghans make up one of the largest refugee populations in the world, with 2.2 million registered in Iraq and Pakistan alone. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good Friday afternoon. A warm southwesterly wind is raising temperatures, so it's quite hot and muggy outside. Seoul is reaching 29 degrees and even hotter in Gyeongsang-Buk-do province, with a heat advisory issued in that area. So please drink lots of fluids, and if you have to be outside, try to find shade or somewhere cool. And that volatility in the air means showers for some inland regions, including Seoul, which could be torrential heavy downpours of up to 40 millimeters with stormy conditions possible. So be aware of changes to the weather forecast. While overall the air quality is great, but another issue for today is ozone level. It's expected to be pretty high during the peak time of mostly in central areas and southern regions. Well, ozone can't be filtered out by a mask, so please refrain from unnecessary travel. And well above normal temperatures should continue for the time being, with frequent rain or showers in the forecast. And finally, the rainy season is going to kick off from early next week, starting from Jeju and the south coast. Well, have a great weekend, and let's take a look at the worldwide weather conditions.
That brings us to the end of this week's editions of the Daily Report. Have a good weekend. See you on Monday.
I'm a professional chef specialized in Korean food, 한식. I've been cooking for 12 years. Today, I'm cooking samgyeopsal, Korean pork belly. Samgyeopsal is Korean soul food, fatty, chewy, perfect for barbecue. And we need lots and lots of vegetables. For the sauces, just the Korean